A new study shows Texas's 2021 voting law making it harder for black and brown folks to vote, especially by mail. The law requiring an ID number to match precisely with your voter registration caused nearly 30,000 ballots to get tossed in the 2022 primaries, meaning almost 90% of those folks never got to vote at all. Many still have not returned to the ballot box. Kevin Morris is Senior Research Fellow at the Brennan Center's Democracy Program. Glad you are joining us. First and foremost, let's understand this here, Kevin. The Trump folk pulled out of the lawsuit in Texas over redistricting, saying that they basically said we didn't care that it was negatively impacting black and brown people. This is no shock here. This is the kind of stuff that Texas Republicans have been doing because Texas is a state that is 61% minority, yet 61% of the people that vote in Texas are white.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. We've seen, especially over the last 10, 12 years since the Supreme Court struck down a major part of the Voting Rights Act that used to keep some of the behavior in Texas in check. We've seen them pass a number of bills that have made it more difficult for voters of color to cast their ballots and make their voices heard, from voter ID to what we're talking about this evening, the Texas SB1 that they passed in 2021 after, of course, all of the shenanigans around the 2020 election and the big lie.
And remember, when those things were passed, they were angry that Donald Trump lost. He won Texas. He won Georgia. He won Florida. But they still changed their laws because they didn't want it to be close.
I mean, we don't know exactly what was going on inside the minds of the legislators, but we can look at the data, and the data makes it very clear. What's that?
Actually, I think we can. Again, we saw they kept talking about voter fraud. The Brennan Center has studied this. Numerous others. Voter fraud is virtually non-existent. And so it made no sense at all that these red states were changing their laws, but they actually fell for the okie doke, advancing Donald Trump's lies. The election was rigged. And so therefore, they went about changing these laws to actually make it harder for votes, because Republicans have even said if they actually can contract the vote, they stand a better chance at winning. They don't want everybody voting. Republicans have literally said that.
No, I think, there is definitely an anti-democratic movement happening in the United States. After the 2020 election, we saw the biggest wave of restrictive voting legislation since we've seen probably since the end of Jim Crow. Since the end of Reconstruction in the 1800s. So there is something going on, and we absolutely know. We know the effects of these laws is that they make it more difficult for voters of color to make their voices heard. You were talking about the maps in Texas. Some of these maps have made it more difficult for the votes that are cast to be translated into political power, because they've been racially gerrymandered and kind of locked out of political power in some places. And a number of these have been struck down by the courts. And you're exactly right. Watching the Department of Justice walk away from some of these cases that were being brought over the last few years, it's extraordinarily troubling.
Yeah, and so when you look at this vote in Texas, and again, we know how these other states, when these large states move, they follow. And so the problem is when they pass these laws, they're now enshrined into law, and it really is creating problems. And so what have people go, oh, I don't understand what the big problem is with a voter ID. The issue is not even a voter ID. It's all the things that they put in place that go along with the voter ID to actually drive people away because they want to frustrate folks to make it hard to vote. They don't want to make it easier.
That's exactly right. We always say it's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? Because you can show up and you can have your ballot thrown out, was the case in Texas SB1 in one election. And what we find is that people don't come right back to the ballot box. They don't even necessarily try to vote. Some of them are going to walk away from the democratic process because they're going to say, I tried before. It didn't work very well. Why am I going to waste my time doing it again? So it's kind of understanding the life cycle of these restrictive voting policies and how they can shape behavior for years and years, even after maybe some voters have figured out how to make sure that their application to vote by mail or their mail ballot isn't going to get rejected. You're exactly right about that.
Questions from the panel. Mustafa, you first.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. So we know that these types of things are currently going on, right? We have the erosion of our voting rights. As somebody who works in this space, what would you share with us to get people to be able to better protect their voting rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to be supporting community organizations that are doing a lot of this work, that are teaching Americans and particularly voters of color what they need when they show up at the polling place. We know all around the country, local groups, churches, and local get out the vote organizations are doing this, but they need the resources to be able to do it well. But we also need the federal government to act. We need to make sure that the Department of Justice is not walking away. And we need to make sure that everyone knows that we're watching them and that we're aware of what they're trying to do. Over the longer time horizon, we need to get the Voting Rights Act back to its full power. I mentioned this before, but in 2013, in a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court got rid of one of the most powerful parts of the Voting Rights Act, and we've been without it for the last 12 years. And we know that this part of the Voting Rights Act, it might have actually stopped the Texas bill that we're talking about tonight from going into effect, because the Department of Justice itself thinks that, or thought under the old administration, we should say, that this was discriminatory and violated Section 2, the part of the Voting Rights Act that still remains. So I think it has to be both local, right? We have to be supporting local groups, but we have to recognize that we need federal power here as well to make sure that states are not going to discriminate.
Larry?
Yeah, thank you for your work. I was going to ask you about Shelby County versus Holder. It's kind of where things have kind of took a right turn, literally, so to speak. But I guess my other question is in terms of historically, Black churches have played a very important role in terms of getting people registered to vote. Where I'm at in Florida, there's certainly been a lot of steps to make it more difficult for nonprofit organizations to GOTV. And I'm wondering, how do you see things playing out over the next couple of years as we continue to see this assault on voting rights?
Yeah, we're watching. There are a couple of Supreme Court cases that are going to come out later this summer about redistricting and racial gerrymandering. I will admit it is a little bit difficult to be optimistic about things right now, but I do, we're seeing some states pass state Voting Rights Act, Virginia, New York, Connecticut. We've seen some states say the federal government's not going to introduce pre-clearance and make sure that laws are not going to be discriminatory before they go into effect, that we're going to take it into our own hands. So we are seeing some action on that front, which is encouraging. Some of the states that are maybe the worst actors are not necessarily going to be policing their own behavior. But I think, what comes out of the court's decisions this summer around redistricting are going to be important. Alabama passed a congressional map last year that the federal court called discriminatory against Black voters, and they just appealed it to the Supreme Court last week. So we'll see if that moves forward. But there's a lot of question marks right now, definitely.
Tyler.
Yes, thank you again for your work as well. I think we want to call it what it is. Texas is not restricting votes to protect democracy. They're doing it to protect power. And I think the latest findings prove what we already know to be true, that this is a modern day literacy test. And, and coming from someone that's like for young people, especially first time voters and students, with those who without driver's license, this is targeted and strategic. What does your research show the drastic impact that this will have on first time and young voters?
Yeah, so the paper that we published last week, Texas has never been easy to vote by mail. So for the most part in Texas, you got to be 65 or older to cast a mail ballot. They didn't change that during COVID. They haven't changed that in a long time. So this study was actually more focused on older voters. And these are voters that have voted time after time after time. 85% of them voted in the 2016 and 18 and 2020 election. And these people had these big turnout effects and they had their ballots rejected, right? So we know that if these people with a super strong habit of voting, if these people that have been doing this for a long time, if they're having their ballots rejected, their ballots thrown out, then that's a big problem, because then these effects are likely to be other parts of the law that we didn't study in this particular study. If they're having these effects on habituated voters, they're going to be having big effects on other voters as well. So this is we think maybe the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of how this whole regime of restrictive voting laws, both in Texas and elsewhere, are shaping political behavior for years. And we know, I should add, we know that
All right,
younger
Kevin,
voters for whom there isn't that habit of voting, it's more likely that they're going to drop out and not come back. So, yeah.
All right, Kevin, we surely appreciate it. Thanks a bunch. Keep up the good work.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.